Hi, good evening. Today we're starting with The Starling and the Crow. It's illustrated by Eric Hansen. A starling, one of 1,000, that lived and bickered in the great elm, met a crow one morning and passed the time of day. They met frequently after that, since their daily paths crossed as the crow flew to the cornfield and the starling to the rye. They didn't say much, for the starling spoke only a little crow, and the crow's starling was far from fluent. But the word got around among the starlings that the familiarity of the starling and the crow was not good. "He's selling us out to the crows," cried an important starling, who had started the story that starlings were starlings because they owned the stars. "He was giving them the plans to our nests. He believed in their cause. His feather was a crow on his mother's side." The innocent starling demanded a public hearing, but the starlings made so much noise accusing him and one another of unstarling activities and pro-crowism that he couldn't make himself heard. "Are you a crow, or aren't you?" shouted Senator Upstarling. The starling said, "No, I am not." But he couldn't be heard above the babble and bickering, threats, warnings, accusations, innuendos, and the shouts of the photographers and newspapermen. "Guilty of whatever it is he's guilty of," declared the judge. "I can't hear a goddamn thing, and I'm late for a date with a flycatcher in the rye." "Throw him to the butcher birds," cried half of the starlings, and there was a great pecking and clawing and flying of feathers, during which the crows attacked the elm and took it over without any trouble to speak of. Moral: familiarity also breeds contempt proceedings. The generalissimo of all the field mice in the world. Illustrated by Adele Rodriguez. The generalissimo of all the field mice in the world lived in a wild, secluded Nebraska field, which the generalissimo believed was all the earth and the universe. "If you burrow too far in any direction," he decreed, "you will burrow your way out of the planet, plunge into everlasting space." "What happens to you then?" his wife asked him one night, after removing his army boots and his scarlet and gray uniform. "There is no finality," said the generalissimo with finality. "You just keep on falling forever." All the other creatures that lived below the grass were in awe of the great field mouse, who knew so much about everything. "I am a general and a philosopher," he said. Or he would say, drinking a liquor made of dandelion roots and oil of viper's bugloss. "A general is no good unless he can justify his actions, and a philosopher is no good unless he can protect his inactivity by throwing a military guard around his seclusion." The other field mice, and the moles and the chipmunks and gophers didn't know what generalissimo was talking about, but they figured that if it was beyond their comprehension, it might be worth believing in. They came to hate creatures like the crickets and grasshoppers, who were just as smart as their leaders. For a time, the generalissimo was satisfied with the title he had forced the field mice to confer on him by acclamation. But then he decided that they wanted him to be the generalissimo and, in the end, the generalissimo. As soon as he had been given the magnificent title, it became clear to him that the other creatures who lived underground needed to be protected from their own freedom. He called in his chief burrower and explained that his burrows must be connected up with the burrows of the moles and chipmunks and the gophers. When the chief burrower explained that this would be aggression, he disappeared one night and was never seen again. And a new chief burrower took his place. Aggression, said the generalissimo, is anything that stands in the way of our protecting the other creatures from their freedom. So the field mice began to extend their tunnels and corridors until they were all connected up with the tunnels and corridors of the neighbor moles, chipmunks, and gophers. Note: this is an unfinished fable. The manuscript ends here. It's the only one without a moral in this story. The Bright Emperor, illustrated by R.W. Blackman. The particular beetles, whose vast empire was the small backyard of a house on Fifth Avenue, were astonished one day in May when one of their members, known as a ne'er-do-well, returned after a long absence wearing a shining silver helmet on his head. Perched just above his eyes, it allowed the feelers full play, but was very becoming and impressive, although it seemed a trifle heavy for one unused or wearing anything on his head except an occasional drop of rain. The emperor of the beetles, a plain, unadorned beetle, lived in an overturned box that had once belonged to a dog. There was a damp rug in the box. This palace was looked upon by the beetles as the finest palace in the world. When the emperor heard the uproar that followed the return of the beetle with the silver helmet, he sent for him. Silver Helmet refused to go to the emperor for a simple reason that his helmet was so high he couldn't get inside the box that was the emperor's palace. There was just room for ordinary beetles, without anything on their heads, to crawl into the box. Silver Helmet sent word to the emperor that if the emperor wanted to see him, the emperor would have to come outside. My goodness. I can't stop yawning, I'm so sorry. This arrogant pronouncement awed the beetles who heard it, and when Silver Helmet went on with a long rigmarole about how the helmet had been placed on his head by a goddess, a great and magnificent goddess, who was supremely lovely and benign, they began to believe that the brightly crowned beetle had been divinely ordained to seize the throne from the emperor and rule over them instead. Times weren't any worse in the Beetle Empire than they were anywhere else in this particular epoch, but the beetles gradually talked themselves into believing that the old emperor was responsible for everything that hadn't gone exactly, and that the beetle with the silver crown would bring an unheard of peace and prosperity to the community. There were a few beetles who took no interest one way or the other, because they believed that the world was coming to an end. Anyway, just make sure. Anyway, but the great majority rallied around the silver-crowned beetle and declared him emperor. The dethroned emperor, warned of the revolt, fled just in time, and his wife and 78 children. They escaped to another kingdom simply by crawling through a small hole in the fence leading to the next yard. The new emperor took up his headquarters under a smaller box in the yard, into which he could crawl, helmet and all, and ruled the beetles in a rather so-so fashion. For several weeks, sitting around in the sun, taking no part in the gathering of food or in anything else, and elaborating on his story of all the beautiful goddess who had given him the silver helmet. He asserted that he was immortal, and that he was glorified, that he was immune from illness or injury, and that the laws which applied to everybody else did not apply to him. The other beetles were deeply impressed, and brought him the nicest bits of cereal and other delicacies that they found. He grew so fat that he could squeeze in and out of his palace only by a great effort and still keep his silver crown on. One day, a lady and a small child who lived in the house to which the yard belonged came out into the yard because it was a fine sunshiny day. The little girl, who was 4 years old and known as the nastiest child in the neighborhood, saw the silver-crowned beetle and set up a cry. "Oh, Grace," she cried, for she called her mother Grace. "Look, there's the bug I caught and put on my thimble on." She pointed at the Emperor's magic crown, which was indeed a tiny thimble that had been a birthday present to the little girl from her Aunt Clara, who lived in Bronxville. "Well, of all the things," said the child's mother, and she started for the beetle. It ran, and so did all the others. But whereas all the others escaped, the Emperor was unable to find any hole or crevice large enough for him to get into hurriedly. The child's mother killed him with an old broom, used for sweeping up trash, and recovered the thimble. "Now don't you ever put it on a bug's head again," she said. The idea! What would come, Aunt Clara thinks. After the mother and child had gone back into the house, the beetles crept cautiously out of their hiding places and looked, in awe, at the dead emperor. He looked like any dead beetle now. Then they sent a delegate into the next yard to ask the old emperor to return, which he did, and his wife and 98 children and the beetles all settled down to a drab and uneventful life. Of the many morals which attach to the story, the one I like best is something about never accepting a gift of radiance from a woman, or whatever age, for the moment of glory it gives cannot compensate for the disaster which must inevitably follow. Jesus Christ. Okay, my man. We will end it there. We're almost done with this book. I will be going to Barnes & Noble and finding another one, I'm sure. I hope you sleep well. See you tomorrow.